Hello and welcome back to topic 3 on plant reproduction and breeding. So up until this point you will have looked at asexual reproduction and you will have also looked at sexual reproduction using cones. In this video we are going to look at sexual reproduction using flowers, so plants that we would consider to be called angiosperms. So other plants that don't have cones can still reproduce sexually. They just do so using flowers. Okay, and seed plants that have flowers have a fancy name. They're actually called angiosperms. Okay, so they have kind of also a fancy name. So we had like coniferous trees, and then we have angiosperms that can use flowers. So the whole process looks very similar with flowers. There's just more parts to remember. Okay, there's more parts to a flower that we're going to look at. So, uh, flowers generally have bright petals on them, and they also have kind of a sugary fluid in them as well, called nectar, that will help attract pollinators. Okay, so in this top picture, we can see that we have a bee sitting on a flower. Now, bees are very, very important pollinators. So what they do is they carry pollen from one flower over to the next. So bees actually really help us with fertilizing and reproduction of flowers. So if you remember before when we were talking about the trees uh, and how their pollen, a large part of it's just going to end up falling to the ground. The same thing would happen with flowers if they only relied on wind. When you use a bee that lands on one flower and flies straight over to the next flower, it's a much more effective way of transferring pollen. Okay? So if we think about it, that would be a symbiotic relationship, if you remember from Unit 1. And I'll give you a second to think what type of symbiotic relationship that is. It would be mutualism. So the bees are getting the ingredients that they need to ultimately go back and start creating honey. Um, and the flower is getting fertilized. So flowers are adapted to their environment and their pollination method. Okay, some are small, large, or contain no petals, and often flowers will have a strong scent to attract pollinators to them. Okay, this plant up at the top right where this gentleman is sitting by and smiling, it's actually kind of funny that he's got a bit of a smile, as that plant smells very, very, very bad. And that's one of its adaptations to help keep animals away from it, is that its scent is just atrocious. Now, I've never actually seen one or been by one, but from what I've read on the internet, it is pretty bad. Okay, parts of the flower. So this is probably the biggest topic within this. This is probably the biggest part within this topic, or the topic 3 notes. Okay, so the parts of the flower. So if we take a look, the petals are generally bright colored. Okay, and the flower's way of attracting pollinators like bees is to have, again, bright flowers and to also have that kind of sweet smelling nectar within it. So the sepals are green parts underneath the flower that protects it before it opens. Now, as the flower just about, as it's just about to bloom, those sepals are actually going to change and be the same color as the petals. So if you take a look on YouTube, there's a slow motion video or a time lapse of flowers blooming. If you go to YouTube and you take a look for that time lapse of flowers blooming, you'll notice that the sepal is oftentimes the same color as the petals by the time it gets around to the flower blooming. So it's not always going to be green. Okay. Now we're going to break this flower down a little bit over the next few slides. So the female part of the flower is called the pistil. Okay, so if I go back up here, you can see that the pistil has 3 parts to it: the stigma, the style, and the ovary. Okay, and that's that green portion that's running up the middle. So that is all of this. Okay, so if we take a look, the stigma is the sticky tip that captures pollen grains. So again, this pollen could be potentially coming, floating through the air, being carried by the wind, or it could be something that's carried by a bee. Now, I remember that stigma and sticky both start with the letters S and then T and then I. So stigma and sticky kind of sound a little bit the same. So that might help you remember that it's the sticky tip that captures the pollen grains. So once the pollen grains come in and go down to the stigma, what they're going to do is they are also going to form a pollen tube, and they're going to work their way down the style. Okay, so the style is just a tube that connects the stigma and the ovary. Okay, now the ovary down at the bottom, the ovary is a tiny chamber that contains the plant's eggs. Okay, or another word for eggs is ovules. So ovules is like the more scientific term for eggs. So the ovary is just a protecting chamber that holds these eggs, and it's also where if pollen makes its way down and pollen is able to attach to an ovule and combine themselves, this is where the seeds will be formed. So the seeds will be formed in this part of the plant. Okay. Then we have the male parts of the flower. Okay, if I go back to our main diagram, I want you right now to take a look at how many things look like they're stamen, okay, and that's a combination of an anther and a filament, versus how many things look like they're part of the pistil or the female part. Okay, so if I start looking at this, I can see that I have one, oh, red wasn't maybe a super great color for that one. Let's go to blue. So I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I have 10 different stamen in this flower, okay? But I only have one pistil. Okay, so 10 stamen, one pistil. And lots of flowers are like this. They have many, many more uh, male ones. So again, I want you to think of what the reasoning behind this might be. So if you remember us talking earlier, we said that when the pollen's produced, especially if it's carried by wind, there's a good chance that it never makes it um, to another flower. So if you think, imagine you have a flower with one stamen, so just one pollen producing part. Chances are its pollen is going to end up on the ground somewhere. It's never actually, it doesn't have a very good probability of fertilizing another plant. So that plant's going to die off. Okay, and it may never have reproduced and passed on its genetic information. But if you think about one that has like 6 or 7 or even 10 stamen, it produces much more pollen. Okay, so chances are that plant is actually going to get its pollen over to a female part somewhere, and it will actually be able to reproduce, and it'll pass on its genetic information. Another flower with, somewhere around 10 stamen is going to be produced. So those that have a large amount of stamen have a better chance of reproducing, and therefore a better chance of producing on or passing on their genetic information, and therefore the next flower will look, somewhat similar. So those things that uh, are created that don't have great adaptations to their environment generally don't survive long enough or don't pass on their genetic information. They don't reproduce. So the male part of the flower is called the stamen. Now, if you take a look at the end of the word stamen, it says men. Okay. Now I use this to help me remember that this is the male part of the flower. Okay. So the amount in each plant can vary. Okay. Now, if we take a look at the anther, this is the part that produces and releases pollen. Okay, so it produces and releases pollen. So that's that part up here at the very top. So eventually they burst open and the pollen comes out. Okay, now the filament. Now, how I remember this one is going to be a little bit of a stretch, and you might, think I'm crazy here, or who knows, maybe just the ridiculousness of this might actually work. But I remember that another word that starts with F is a flagpole. Okay, and that's basically all the filament is. The filament is a glorified flagpole. It holds the anther up nice and high where it can come into contact with things like wind or where it can come into contact with a bee. If we go back to our diagram here in the red and we imagine that our anthers were all down here, okay, there's less chance of them coming into contact with a bee, and there's like zero chance of the wind getting them because they're sheltered by the flower. So we want them up high, where as the wind blows across the top of the flower, it'll carry some of the pollen, or as the bee is trying to get in, the bee bumps into a whole bunch of them and it weasels its way through as it gets its way kind of down into the petals. So again, we definitely want our anthers to be up high. It gives it the best chance of moving its pollen. And to do that, it needs its flagpole or its filament to actually hold it up. So we talked about this a little bit earlier, but we're going to go just one step deeper now. So we have pollination, and it can happen in two ways. So self-pollination, okay, or cross-pollination. So if you think about yourself, you're talking about one person. You're talking about you. Okay. If we're talking about a flower for self-pollination, it means that its own male part, its own stamen, uh, gave pollen over to its own female part or its own pistil. Okay? Now, in cross-pollination, we have sperm or we have pollen from one plant fertilizing a different plant. Okay, this is a little bit more ideal for plants. Okay, this is the chosen method. Now, if you take a look at a plant diagram here, you'll notice, and we're going to look at this one over here. Now, I've circled all the stamen. Notice that they're actually lower than the stigma. This happens for a reason as well. Okay, if they were higher, so imagine they were up here. Okay, as the wind blew and pollen fell off, it would fall onto its own stigma, or as a bee, which I'm not going to try and draw, but as a bee bumped into this, it could also be dropping pollen off onto its own stigma. And again, it doesn't really want to self-pollinate. It would rather receive some genetics from another plant and be able to create that diversity or those differences. So we see here that we have them down below. That way there's less chance of it fertilizing itself. Okay, so most plants, again, are really going to want to do that cross-fertilization. As for self-pollination, again, pollinating yourself. And then just to kind of recap what we looked at before, so once the pollen grain hits the stigma, there's a pollen tube that grows down the style and into the ovary. That's going to enter an ovule, and you're going to have this whole kind of seed start to function. Okay, and that's we're going to look at how the seeds grow and eventually kind of become a plant in the next video. Okay, so we have a video on pollination here. If you would be interested in watching it, you're going to want to go into the actual slides again and click play. Again, methods of pollination. So another video that you can watch in the slides. Just kind of on our last slide here then, just to think it through. So what would be the advantage or disadvantage of sexual reproduction? And what would be the advantage or disadvantage of asexual reproduction? I'd like you to pause the video here and see if you can come up with these. Okay, so the advantage of sexual reproduction is that we get different combinations of traits. Here we get genetic variety, here genetic diversity. So all of those things just mean that the offspring that's produced are not always going to be the same. Okay, now sometimes that's not going to be a benefit, but lots of times it is. And again, it helps us from having a whole area of plants that are genetically identical. And again, if something comes through that those plants are susceptible to or can't really deal with, they're all going to die. And then that leaves us with nothing. Okay, so that's not super great. So an advantage of sexual reproduction is that we get a variety of different things. Now, a disadvantage of sexual reproduction is that it's very slow, especially compared to asexual reproduction. So an advantage of asexual reproduction is that it's quick, and we also have control over exactly what we're going to get. Okay, so if you have a really desirable or a good positive plant that you want an exact copy of, if you reproduce it asexually, you get that exact copy of the plant, and you can continue to do so over and over. A disadvantage of asexual reproduction is that you get an exact copy of the plant. Okay, so if it's not a positive plant, you're going to lose out on the chance to gain new traits. And also, as we talked about before, if you have a whole area of things that are identical, there's a chance that you could lose them all at once, depending on what conditions arise. So that's the topic 2 video, or the second video for topic 3. So please refer back to Google Classroom as to what to do next.